Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live webinar session today. My name is Meredith Grace, and I will be the facilitator of today's event. And I'd like to thank everyone who is in attendance today. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. As we are all well aware, the best laid plans for 2020 have had to be rethought. Basically, everything from daily lives, education, and business included under that umbrella. It's been imperative to digitally transform our places of work to be able to operate effectively. And those companies that are able to use technology well enough to keep going and rethink their business model for the future by fast tracking digital transformation plans will be the ones ahead of their competition at the end of this. Now, I will let our experts today speak to that in just a moment, but first, a few technical details. So today's session will be 45 minutes in length, and we very much appreciate everyone spending part of their day with us. During this session, all attendees will be in listen-only mode, but are encouraged to participate by submitting questions and feedback using the questions panel on your screen. We'll try and get to questions over the course of the webinar, but if we don't have time to answer your question during the live session, we'll reach out to you directly afterward with more information. This webcast is also being recorded and will be made available to all registrants after the event, so keep an eye on your email inbox for that later on. All right, now let me go ahead and introduce today's speakers. First off, we have Shannon Krefts, who is the VP of Product Marketing at Medius and bringing over 20 years of experience with source-to-pay solutions and operational data analytics. On the other hand, we also have Paul Noel. He's a practitioner of sourcing and procurement with also 20 years of experience contributing to the innovation and growth stages of several major players in the spend management software space. So enough of me talking at this point. I will hand over now to our experts to speak on today's webinar topic.
Thank you so much, Meredith. I know that 20 years, it's actually close to 25 for me, which is just crazy when I think about things. And it reminds me a lot about when we talk about procurement digital transformation, what that really means. When I actually started out as a buyer 25 years ago, this is what my digital transformation was. It was moving from paper to what we'd often refer to as green screens. And I looked, I couldn't actually find an Oracle purchasing green screen, but found a payroll register. And it's amazing how they were all very similar. And then we got excited with what we called GUI, this graphical user interface, that allowed us to suddenly use a mouse to navigate around a system. And then over time, we have seen moving from kind of a on-present or client-based application to more of a web-based application, but still, able to move around a bit more. And finally, now we're in much cleaner experiences for procurement, just in terms of the way that we interact with the system, in the way that our users can interact with the system. It's been a lot easier for us to move around, which has really allowed procurement to focus on what its main goals or priorities in an organization are. And for me, I think back to when I first started working as a buyer, my first obligation was cost savings, cost savings, cost savings. It was all about saving money for the organization. That was the main priority that I was focused on. And as I did more as a buyer and became a senior buyer and started buying other kinds of commodities for the organization, I learned about reducing risk as a key thing that as a purchasing person you needed to think about. It wasn't just getting the best price, but making sure you were working with the best suppliers out there, that you could ensure supply when you needed it and get it across the organization as demanded. And the best way to really do that was to partner with the business. It's never fun when procurement is thought of as the bad guy that says no all the time. You really want procurement to be the person that is actually working with a business to understand their needs and even proactive in that part. So to me, these procurement priorities have always been around, and the whole idea of digitization of procurement allows us to focus on these more by having tools that help make that easier. And when we think about the beginning of the year, we thought, okay, how are we going to make this happen? So what are the priorities going on, or what are the predictions of what will actually happen in 2020 for procurement? And when I looked back into did some research back in January, I found a couple of sources, and again, they were still talking about the digital transformation through technology, how we could use better technology to achieve the goals of procurement. There was also a lot of talk about global supply chain concerns. Even then we were looking at things like trade wars that were going on internationally. We knew tariffs were moving or being imposed on different countries based on political climate. And then there was always Brexit. So within EMEA, we were wondering how things were going to happen and move across. And of course, people were also talking about elevating sourcing's role to ensure that sourcing had a role to play, kind of moving from these negotiations we would do periodically to making that a more integral part of the business. And when you think about it, these three predictions actually align really closely with those procurement priorities. So we know cost savings can be directly attributed by being able to source more quickly. So we can actually do more sourcing when we have better technologies that help us get through the process. Again, reducing risk is a big part about making sure that we can address the global supply chain issues and knowing what's happening out there with our current economic environments. And of course, elevating sourcing's role is about being a better partner with the business. So to me, I like these predictions for 2020 because they align with exactly what the goals for a procurement organization should be doing anyway, but we're able to focus in some specific key areas. So we were all moving along, and then suddenly life kind of changed dramatically for all of us around the February and March timeframe, when a lot of organizations were suddenly kind of going on pause and we're not moving forward with anything. It was a bit of a regroup and understand what we should be doing right now. We've actually been doing at Medius a lot of work with Gartner, and we've worked with them, and they've put out a presentation or document, actually, one of their studies on evaluating your finance transformation program during a pandemic. And this was interesting because it actually was talking about how finance is actually dealing with this pandemic. And the reason I think it's important to think about finance right now is because as a procurement person in an organization, especially in a smaller or medium-sized industry, you actually have finance really as the boss that we report to. Unless there is a chief procurement officer, finance is really what is often in control of procurement, or you're reporting up to that. So really understanding what finance's needs are can help procurement align to understand the priorities in an organization. And I also like to talk about our CFO here at Medius, Anders, how when we all got together to discuss, what we were going to do about this pandemic and how it was going to impact our business, he said, as a CFO, his role in finance was to ensure the continuous operations, to make sure that the organization could keep functioning, and also to keep functioning for our customers to be able to sustain them through this period of time. And if we look at this report and what it talks about CFOs were looking about, one of them was shifting from overall growth in an organization to that business continuity and making sure that we could continue doing what we needed to do. There was also a focus, again, on enhancing your cash position. So understanding what cash we had on hand and ensuring we had that cash on hand, as well as helping to reduce costs. So those can go hand in hand together. Have more cash, I need to reduce my costs. Also, a big thing for this was improving remote working. Now, we might not always think about this as the kind of priority that a CFO or even a procurement person might have, but we knew that as people were not able to always get into their offices where they needed to, or you had new people coming in to help replace people that weren't able to come in or to be able to be there, we needed this ability to have remote working and have people access systems and do the things they needed to do without having to be physically present. A big way that you can do that is by having process standardization. So you need to make sure that people know what they should be doing, especially if you have people that need to come in and step in for others. So the way a order should be approved or a sourcing event run, there should be guidelines and processes that people are always following. And finally, taking a look at the longer term by challenging your basic assumptions, your present day assumptions of how things need to work. And they have a nice little graph they put together around this, which was, I can see it here, accelerate or pause, pivot, and accelerate, reprioritizing what you need to do. So we're all taking a moment to pause and understand where we are, pivot to what is new, and then accelerate to keep it all going, again, with this constant evaluation. Again, focusing on reducing costs along the way, and then helping to reimagine what you might do next. And again, I think it's just important to take a look at what CFOs are doing right now, and understanding that, because we can easily apply that to what is happening in procurement. And I thought I would actually start by talking about an organization that we worked with that actually did a lot of all of these things kind of prior to the pandemic, but it absolutely applies to what we're talking about in the cases of really stopping to understand what you're doing, reimagining it, trying something new, and then putting that as a process moving forward. We were working with Austal, which is a global contractor and shipbuilding company. It is actually based in Australia, but we were working with their North American group. And they were getting their goods from the same places they were always getting them before. They had some obviously really strong procurement people in place and felt that they were always getting the best price for everything that they needed. And we went to them and kind of challenged those assumptions and said, why don't you try a reverse auction to try to see if we can squeeze out a little bit more money for you as part of this process. And they were really skeptical about it. They didn't think that this was going to work. But we persuaded them to give it a try, and they went ahead and did so. And we actually set up something that we call a popcorn auction, which is where we did the prep work ahead of time. We figured out what the right commodities should be. It was actually around some aluminum extrusions, I believe, that we had done. But we figured out, how we were going to set it up, what was a priority in terms of it was a commodity for the business for things that they needed, but it wasn't super crucial. It was something that we could go out and test the waters with. And on the day of the auction, we brought all the key stakeholders into a room and explained to them what was going to happen. And they actually were able to watch this live event with suppliers. And what happened is 10 suppliers came on board, 5 actively participated, and we were able to actually watch the prices go down during this reverse auction as they bid along the way. And what ended up happening is they actually saved 5% on a $2 million contract with their incumbent supplier. The incumbent supplier won the contract for the following year, but actually gave them an additional 5% savings. So that was $100,000 savings they were able to get right away without having to actually do a lot of work and get this going. But it demonstrated the fact that they were able to try something new, evaluate their business, try something new, pivot to this new type of savings opportunity, and created a contract with this supplier that they then evaluated on a regular basis, not just in terms of pricing, but in terms of quality and how things were going. And I think these are good examples of what companies are doing out here today. If you think about it, there really are 4 steps we can take to kind of get us through where we are in procurement and how we can keep the organization going, follow those rules of continuous operations and finance, but also think about it from a procurement perspective and how we can keep the procurement part of the business and our priorities going around cost savings, reducing risk, and working with the business. I think that the 4 actually looking at that are, how can we best handle supplier selection out there? What are the kind of sourcing events we should be doing? Because we all know that there are many, many kinds out there. Once we've agreed to work with a particular supplier, how are we going to actually formalize those arrangements to ensure that we are both working together to help each other out and tracking and monitoring performance? And part of that is also around ongoing supplier management for those suppliers we work with on a regular basis, or for suppliers we're just bringing in once in a while. So to talk about this first, let's actually take a look at supplier selection and what that means. There are a couple of things to think about in terms of supplier selection. The first is really understanding the segmentation of your business and your supplier. So who is business critical? Who do you need to work with on a regular basis, and really ensure that your relationships with those suppliers are spot on, that you're monitoring, managing them, and making sure that you're getting the right suppliers right up front with them. And then you have suppliers, we all have commodity-like suppliers that you often think of in terms of your office supplies, or ones that are just kind of helping things go on in the background, but they're still an important group that you work with. But it's good to be able to segment the two because you probably need to treat them differently, all the way from onboarding them through the questions you would ask to the ongoing day-to-day management of those. We also with them need to look at managing the risk for those suppliers. And there are a couple of things that are pretty key with understanding supplier selection and managing the risk for those. The first is that, is this supplier on the OFAC list? Is it part of the Office of Foreign Asset Control list? You really want to make sure that the suppliers you're working with are not on that list. That's a list of suppliers that have had some issues or fraud. And you want to ensure that you're making sure that your suppliers are worthy of what you're doing. You also need to ensure that you're keeping up with 1099 regulations here in the US. Those change every year. And it's really important to make sure that you're managing those and you're not scrambling at the end of the year whenever you're doing any kind of tax reporting to get that information you need. And also when it comes to supplier onboarding, you really want to make sure that you have a standard process in place and how you're bringing those suppliers on board. Again, you want to make sure that you have the right kind of people in your organization that are designated to do that. In many cases, it's usually just one person responsible for the actual onboarding of a supplier or doing a final approval, but there might be multiple people in the organization that need to review information, that need to ensure that you've captured all the critical data, that I have the correct 1099 forms, that I actually have health and safety information that I need. Anything that's required that I want to go ahead and capture. And sometimes it really comes down to, for my supplier segmentation, what's my 80-20 rule in terms of making sure I'm putting the right kind of effort on my most business critical suppliers. When it comes to managing risk, there are a lot of examples going on right now seeing in terms of spending a lot of money on suppliers or contractors that actually are not even able to deliver on any amount of good or service that they're saying that they can do. And the way to avoid a lot of those things are in terms of making sure when we're onboarding suppliers that we are capturing the right information, and even in terms of references to ensure that they're doing the right thing, and that we know that they're trustworthy. When we know that we have the right kind of suppliers we want to work with, it's important to think about what kind of sourcing events we want to run through with those suppliers. And we know that there are a lot of different types of sourcing events one can do. Gone are the days where you might just pick up the phone and call a supplier and have them shoot you over a price or get a fax for a couple of things. I remember I used to get hardware, like if I needed a particular mouse for someone, I could just call up a couple of suppliers and they would fax me over mice quotes. And I would just look at the best one and go from there. Those aren't the things that we're doing such on a day-to-day basis right now. And you really need to make sure that you're using the right kind of sourcing event for the right kind of good and service. I actually have a friend right now that's in clinical, her organization manages clinical trials and is actually looking at managing trials for these vaccines. And one of the, she is a supplier to other organizations and someone has just put her through an e-auction. And that seemed really strange to everyone in their organization because they thought that that would be more of a partnership and working together and not have them auction out these final responses to what they need to do. So it's really interesting to think about when you're doing a sourcing event, how are you going to handle them? And there are a couple of rules to follow or a couple of things to think about. And I like to break it down into what's the demand, where do things come from, what is the event, what's the best way to handle it, how are you going to evaluate it and award it, and what is the outcome you're going to get. And we all know for low value sourcing processes, those are just things that the cost is pretty low. It might be that mouse that you actually need, or it just has a really quick turnaround. And often can come from a purchase requisition for something new. The best way to handle that is to be able to do a really quick RFQ online or a quick quote. So instead of having to call those vendors like I did in the past and have them fax me information, if I could take a requisition and automatically flip that into the type of event I need and then get the information back really quickly, that really helps me out. And when I'm evaluating that, what I'm really looking at is really more in terms of what's the price? What is the least expensive price that I need here? Or I might have some additional criteria just in terms of, have I worked with this vendor before? What are their payment terms that they're requiring as part of this deal that I would look at? And at the end, I'm probably just going to create a purchase order out of that. It might be a one-time purchase order for an order, or it might be a short-term contract for supplies that I need. When I'm thinking about high value sourcing processes, and I should probably pause a moment and say when I even think about value, value isn't defined just by the amount of money I'm spending. The value might be in the value of those goods or services I need to keep my business running. So it might even be something that is a low cost, but it has a high value in terms of keeping my business on track and continuing to operate. And in that case, I might be looking at doing something based on an upcoming project. So there might be a new build happening somewhere and I need to completely kit out a whole office. Or I might have done some kind of spend analysis. And in order to do that, you certainly need to have all of your spend data in one place, or be able to bring it all together, normalize that data, really categorize it and understand it. Or it could even just be a large purchase request that comes through. And in those cases, you really need to ensure that you're asking your suppliers the same questions, that you are vetting them properly as part of the process. So you might have something like a template library that contains all of the information that you would want to get. You don't have to pull it up in an Excel spreadsheet each time. And again, there could be multiple phases of a process of an RFI, a request for information, to understand your information, to understand the field of vendors as you narrow it down to a more detailed request for proposal. And then there are cases where you might flip that into an auction at the end, but you'd want to make sure that you let your suppliers know about that as part of the process up front. Again, my friend who's going through this, they were quite put off by not knowing that this was part of their process. And if they had known as part of their procurement process to begin with, they probably would have worked differently with that buyer that they have. And then finally, when you are, well, not finally quite yet, we're still evaluating, but when you are evaluating something, again, we're not just looking at price. There's so much more that needs to be taken into consideration. It's going to be, it could be information on who's going to be working on the project. It could be their qualifications. It could be references. We've all answered detailed RFPs in the past. And so you need to be able to score those. And some of that scoring could just be automatic based on what someone is saying to you. And some of it might actually need different people in your organization to review that information. In the old days, I used to send Excel spreadsheets out to everybody, and then I would get their information back, and I'd have to spend all of this time consolidating that information. What we need right now is the ability to do that all online, send that information around electronically, and I'm not even really sending it, it's more of an alert people are receiving, so they can then respond to that, put their information in online, and I can automatically review that. It can be automatically scored to see it based on often complex rules. And what I'll get out of that at the end is it could be a single large purchase order if it came from a very large demand order that I had, or I might actually be creating a contract that would roll out of the sourcing process. So I could take that event and award it and then put it straight into a contract that I then sign and manage with that supplier. Or it could even be catalog items that I stick in my purchasing catalog for that the rest of the organization to buy as they need. Now, there are typical category savings that people will get based on certain commodities that they have by just putting them out to sourcing events that are more managed and qualified, as opposed to an older way of doing it. And the nice thing about having a digital process that makes it easier is you can do more of these types of events. So you have the opportunity to get these savings more often. You know, we found IT is a great place for people to be able to shave off money all the time. And then again, we'll talk about a restaurant that we've worked with before. They found that in certain foods, you know, they could get 6 to 10% of savings that they have. I mean, consultancy is a great one that savings can be brought in all the time. Pretty much anything that you're buying, you could definitely be probably getting a better price on, but you need the ability to tackle those quickly. And what I want to do is actually tell you about Virgin Active, which is someone that we've worked with. People might know the Virgin brand. It's often known as, you know, quite fancy and Tony, as we might say. But Virgin Active is a chain of health clubs and is part of this overall Virgin group. Well, they had gone through an acquisition process and they actually acquired a new health club, and they went from 69 to 122 locations. So, you know, almost doubling in size in overnight. And they found that when they were trying to consolidate these gyms, they wanted them to all look the same and all maintain this Virgin brand. But the problem that they had was there were all these suppliers providing them the same goods, and some looked good and some didn't. So this limited consistency wasn't really good for the Virgin brand. You want to know when you go into a club, it's all going to look and feel the same. So what they actually did is they got their team structure to actually look at all their suppliers, look at the commodities that they were spending money on, and really shifted to focusing on the right supplier selection on the commodities that really mattered. And in their case, commodities were things like towels that they had. Towels are something that you buy, that you use a lot in health clubs. And they actually were able to do a lot of different kinds of sourcing events. They did auctions, and they also did longer term events in terms of RFPs for different people that would come in and provide services for the club. And in 5 events, they were able to save $1 million, which is pretty incredible. And they were also able to reduce their supply base by 46%. Now, part of that actually comes from having, suppliers that often provided the same goods and services because there were 2 organizations coming together, but they were able to really evaluate that. And this was just by looking at 13% of their addressable spend. So there's a lot that can be done by really taking an approach of making sure your supplier selection is on target, and then you're putting in the right kind of sourcing events to handle those activities. Another thing is formalizing those arrangements. And one of the things that people don't often think about is that where are your formal contracts in place? More than 40% of suppliers work without a formal contract, according to a recent study. And what that means is, without a formal contract, there isn't any kind of way to manage your terms and conditions or work with a legal department for that. It's hard to understand what the effective dates are or your overall spend. And it actually ends up being that you don't have the upper hand when it comes to your supplier relationships. A big problem that we actually find often is that people are often caught unaware that a contract is expiring. We had one supplier or one customer of ours we were working with that they went to cancel their relationship with a supplier, or cancel the contract, and said, okay, this contract is ending, we're done. And the supplier came back to them and said, well, one of the clauses in our agreement was actually that if you don't cancel within 90 days, the contract actually rolls over to the following year. And the buyer in that organization just wasn't aware that that clause was the case, because there had been some change in the organization, and all of those agreements were sitting in a file cabinet somewhere that they couldn't find. And we all know in purchasing, and when it comes to contracts, there are so many stakeholders involved that those contracts can be sitting in not just a filing cabinet in purchasing, but all over the organization. Because of course we have the legal department that needs to be involved in the process. We have purchasing, who's hopefully involved in the negotiation, though not always the case. Finance, to make sure that the financial arrangement is sound and secure. Of course, you've got line of business owners, and those might be the ones that initially bring you the contract and just ask you to sign it in purchasing, and we all know we don't like it when that happens. Or you want to be working directly with the line of business to ensure that those terms meet what they need as well. And then there's even marketing, which is something that I've really taken into account in the last several years, in terms of, often suppliers will ask you to be a reference, and that is actually something that can be part of your contract. So to me, that's an interesting negotiation tactic as well, to ensure that marketing is part of this contract that you have. So there's a lot of different stakeholders and people that are involved. And the way to really ensure that you are managing contracts in a simple and streamlined fashion is to have them in a secure cloud repository. And I don't mean Google, because we have a lot of our clients that will say, well, it's all in Google Drive and they should be fine. And we'll see in a moment how that, caused some problems for a supplier that a customer that we worked with. But you also have ways to group contracts together. So we know that in some cases, you might have multiple contracts with a particular supplier, and those contracts might actually rely on one another. So it's really good to make sure that you can pull those together to see what is happening within a supplier, or that if you have contracts that are for certain projects, that you're making sure that those are being maintained and managed. Things like DocuSign integration are really key because you want to ensure that you don't have the signatures just floating around on pieces of paper. We all know DocuSign's been around for quite some time, but it's a great way to directly deal with your supplier and any other people that need to actually be signatories on that contract. And a big thing again that I highlighted in bold were all these management alerts so that you're not caught unaware. And these management alerts don't just have to be about when something is going to expire. We find clients really like to use these in cases of having reviews at a certain point in time, or doing these check-ins to make sure that quality is okay. It could be even alerts within my organization to ensure that internally things are going on as is expected. And then there's a bonus. In some contract management solutions, you can actually manage additional types of contracts. You can have your sales contracts there or employee contracts there. It's a nice way to look at a contract management system as being more robust than just procurement, but being able to actually handle all your contract information in a single place. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about BetVictor, and they are an organization we work with. They're actually a bookmaker and gaming organization, the whole online gambling space that is out there. And as you can imagine, it is a really highly regulated industry. So everything that they do needs to be very securely and strictly managed. And what they found was they were having this over-reliance on Excel documents. And there was just paper-based information. It was everywhere. It was in Google Drive. It was shared. It was all decentralized. They weren't really able to bring it together. And in order to get anything approved, there were 5 forms that needed to be signed, and there could be, up to a 5-step approval process. And it would be sequential the way it was done. So it took a lot of time to make anything happen, and it was actually causing problems with their business. So they really wanted to get a cloud solution where they could actually see any of their contracts at any given place. They wanted to pull them up on their phone if they needed to be able to verify that the contracts were correct. And again, they needed those automated renewals out there. And a big part of it, though, was really just empowering the team with the opportunities to negotiate better, because for this online gambling, a lot of their contracts could be built and done anywhere in the world. And they needed teams across the organization and in different remote locations to be able to get all the information they need, negotiate contracts, and then still have the watchful eye of purchasing and finance, making sure that they were still following the right procedures. And it actually led them to ultimately save cash. And they now have over $135 million under contract management. And a nice thing is they actually were able to do this within a 12-week implementation. You can actually even get contract management systems in quicker than that, depending on what information you want to put in, to start right away, or what you want to build out later. Like, you might start by just having a standard repository for your information with alerts you need, and then you might actually build that out longer to have a more detailed terms and conditions library. Finally, when you're all done with your supplier selection, you've got your sourcing events, and you have these formal arrangements, you don't just shut down the contract and say, see you next year when I get my alert that the contract is expired. It's really important to make sure you've got this ongoing supplier management. And really kind of 5 key things that we find are useful to think about with supplier management are making sure, again, you're organizing your suppliers based on key criteria, like how am I segmenting this supply base, which kind of goes back to that overall supplier selection. But now that I have these suppliers in my system, who's critical, who's a priority, who's just tactical that I need to get things done with, but how can I best manage these suppliers? Also, do I have supplier objectives that I want them to have? And are there certain actions that I need them to respond to on a regular basis? And it's much better to not recreate the wheel every time for this. So for different kinds of suppliers that you have, what is the information that you need from them? And what are you expecting them to do on a regular basis? And a lot of that goes with really managing any supplier-based activities. So are you looking at their quality? Are you looking at how often your invoices are on hold? Are you looking at processing time, for them to get the goods and services to you. You know, how are you actually managing and quantifying what they're actually doing with their activities? Do you have a scoreboard to actually see all of this information and see how people are doing in your organization? And if you have a problem with a supplier, does it actually come down to maybe someone internally that isn't keeping up on their end of it as well? One thing I always like to pause and talk about with supplier relationships is it's really good to not think of it just as a vendor-buyer relationship. You know, the best relationships are actually relationships where you are helping each other out. And especially in these times, I think it's critical to think about keeping your suppliers going because we need them and they need us. And it's helpful if you have these ongoing relationships that you can manage and track. And when there are issues, you can come back to them and figure out what it is. And that goes back to like creating processes. If you're having a problem with a supplier, what are the processes you have in place to actually deal with those? And how are you managing that? And most importantly, how am I storing all of this data? Because again, if I have all of this and it's happening, but it's in paper or offline, it's very difficult for me to manage and do any kind of analytics on this later. So kind of the last case study I wanted to talk about is a supplier we work with that does a lot of food management. They actually run 1,700 pubs and restaurants across the UK. And they are a very mature procurement organization, but it was taking them a long time to get new suppliers on board. They had issues with managing suppliers and actually auditing their activities. I mean, it could even take like 3 to 4 weeks to get a new supplier on board. And if you're talking about a food business, that is just too long when you're dealing with the types of commodities that are going to change often, or you're finding new sources of supply on a pretty regular basis. It often took a month just to get prep work ready for any kind of sourcing event they would do. You know, they didn't even think about doing things like auctions because they didn't have the information they needed or the time to prep for all of that. So just even getting kind of a standard RFQ out the door, they had to pull together what the right questions were they were going to ask, understanding how they were going to score that supplier. It was just a really cumbersome process. So they really wanted to find some kind of solution that would help them become more efficient. What we were able to do was take their entire paper-based contract information and move it online. We were able to move their entire onboarding online for suppliers. We helped create a tiered structure in their supply base for them to really understand when you're working with a supplier that provides critical supplies, you have one form of information you're going to ask. When you have just someone that's giving you more of a commodity, there's another set of questions, but you're still ensuring that they are proper and validated. They did the same thing in terms of automated alerts, with making sure that things didn't expire, that they weren't aware of them. And then they also did a lot with supplier scorecards. So they made sure that they understood how suppliers were doing, not just on their own, but in line with other suppliers of similar types in their organization. And they set up these standing reviews to ensure their suppliers were on target. And what they got out of it was, I mean, they reduced their time for supplier onboarding by 95%. I mean, it actually could say 99%, but they went from, you know, this 3 to 4 week process to really less than a day. They're bringing on at least 30 new suppliers every month. And an interesting thing is they actually have 1,300 authorized users of the system, because since they actually got such a great process in place, they were able to actually roll this out for everyone in the organization. They were able to allow anyone in any organization, any pub or restaurant, do some of these things themselves, and they didn't need purchasing, initiating every activity and kicking it off. It was a really great way for them to bring this all on board with a new line and process. So that for me is kind of my long whirlwind of everything we've been talking about here. I want to actually pull it over to Paul now and have you tell us what you think about all of this.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. It was so there's a number of things that kind of came out to me, and I'm not going to take too much time, folks. We're almost towards the end here, but I did want to kind of pull out a few tidbits here that are interesting to me. Long-time procurement guy and been procurement software for a long time myself. So Understanding the finance team's view of procurement, especially in these times with COVID-19 and so on, is really critical to good success of the process. You need to get them to sign off on it. They're going to be a participant in it, especially when you get down into the AP side of things as it touches procurement. But they hold the purse strings, whether you report to them or not. Finance holds the purse strings, and knowing what their priorities is going to be very important to making a digital transformation work. So I think that those aspects of it were quite interesting, and I think the risk aspects have really been highlighted with COVID-19 coming out. People realize that having your ducks in a row about your suppliers, managing your suppliers well, managing the process for negotiating with suppliers and contracting with suppliers well is really critical to being able to pivot when you need to based on the changing situation that's going on right now. Everybody's seen that in action. Procurement has become a headline thing, especially with ventilators and masks and stuff like that. But it's been a headline thing for government organizations and regular organizations. Everybody's looking around wondering, where is our stuff? Who are we buying it from? And what are the changing circumstances under which we could negotiate as well? And let's do a lot of it. So all of that speaks to digitization. And I'm not just talking about Excel or email or an ERP system, the 3 E's, I like to call that, but more of a specific system that's built around the processes of procurement, sourcing, and AP. And that's what Medius is bringing to bear here. The second big thing, if you can go to the next slide there, Shannon, the second point is just, well, what's the broad value metrics? When you talk to finance, you're going to need to talk about these things. And we focus mostly, especially with those case studies, wonderful case studies where you could see great savings and other things like that. We focused on the upstream here, the supplier management, sourcing, and contracts aspects of it that are in the blue box. And you can see some great savings there. Those are the metrics that we need to kind of push out in front of this to make it worth its while. If it's not just enough to say, hey, we need to digitize what wasn't before so I can answer your questions about suppliers. The downstream is also quite interesting as well. And it's important to have a system that can grow with you, that can start in perhaps one of these columns, but then move to the others in an effective and integrated way. And that's an important aspect as well, so worth pointing out. And then the last bit here is sort of a call to action for you folks. Shannon did a great job of going into depth about each of these 4 possible steps, but there's by no means a requirement that you go in any particular order or that you do all of them. You could just do one. Start with one and pick a provider that can do all 4 plus, but start with one. And so the real question is where to start for you. Looking at some of those case studies, I think you can get some insights about what might be possible. Maybe a quick hit, like let's do an auction on a sourcing event for incumbent suppliers because of the changing circumstances. Maybe that's something you do. Or perhaps it's around going out and looking at your supply base and organizing it again, maybe doing a risk profile on the top suppliers around ongoing supplier management. Whatever it is, let's do something and let's get started on something. So that would be kind of the call to action that came out of what I just heard from Shannon. That's about it in terms of my insights. Handing back to you, Meredith, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And thank you, Shannon. You guys both contributed so much today, and I think that our audience really appreciated it. So thank you. Now, I want to extend a huge thank you to everyone who is attending, listening right now, watching the recording later today. If we didn't have time to get to your question, please don't fret. We'll be reaching out to you soon with more information. And if you're still craving more industry insights, head on over to mediusflow.com and check out our library of on-demand webinars, along with many other helpful resources. Thanks again, everyone. We hope to speak with you all again soon.